Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is week 7. Excuse me while I scroll back up. Another fun-filled week in thesis writing class, of course. Hopefully, by this point, you have submitted your annotated bibliography, although I know a lot of those were missing. And you are ready to move on and deal with the lit review. Now, hopefully, again, last week you were working on your lit review because, be reminded, that's due at the end of this week. So Sunday on the 7th, that's due on or before midnight, at or before midnight. And there were a couple questions that came in over the weekend that I just wanted to clarify. One, there is no worksheet for the lit review, so you'll want to write this as though it is in your actual paper, because it will be in your actual paper. Of course, you can edit and take feedback that I'll give you at the end of this assignment before you put it into the final paper. Another question was, are there examples that we can look at that might be helpful as we make our own lit review? The answer is yes. Honestly, starting close here, we have 2 examples on our Blackboard site under Documents, and those will allow you to see sort of how it looks for a quantitative and a qualitative paper. You might go with the one that best represents your own paper. If you want to go beyond that, you can absolutely go to the journals, the databases, look up any article really, and they're going to have a lit review. I mean, it's just a standard part of a paper. So, there's no shortage of what those might look like. There's a couple here on the Blackboard site, but there's also countless others, on databases. You could probably even Google search, academic, and then whatever topic you want, and then you'll find the articles. So there's no shortage there. For this week, what we're going to do is try to get you to a point, if you're not there already, to understand exactly what you want to do in terms of the method for your study. You've already decided on the topic, and through your lit review, you will come up with the research question, or for some people, maybe a hypothesis. But generally, I think most of you are going to use a research question. If you're confused or you are not sure which one to use, we can definitely talk about it, but it's usually safer to go with a research question. Now, if you find in your work with your lit review that there's a lot out there already that leads you to believe that you would be able to predict what's going to happen, you could definitely use a hypothesis. However, remember, with that, you'll want to use one of these quantitative methods that we've got, an experiment or a survey, to test the hypothesis. And again, if you need to get to that with the actual performance of the study, the method section describes it, but then actually doing it, you let me know if you need help with that, and I can absolutely back you up with what you need. Now, as I said, this is week 7, so we're going to look at these quantitative and qualitative methods. This starts on page 32, so let's jump down to it. What you'll notice when you get here is that and it says it right here in the paragraph, that we've already looked at quantitative and qualitative methods. We've looked at specific ones, but what we have not done yet is looked at how they work. So what you'll see here on the top will be sort of what it is, a quick description of it. And then on the bottom will be how you do it. So let's look at that for a minute. We're going to start with quantitative. Again, I think most of you are going to lean more toward qualitative methods based on what we saw in those surveys. But still, you never know. If you're on the fence, listen to all this, see where you're at. You may think you want to do one approach, but then realize maybe this other one's better. Maybe you think, like I used to wrongly, that experiments or survey work is just way too much work and that you'll have less to do if you do it qualitatively. That's not always true. In fact, it's usually never true. It seems like there might be more work, but there's usually not, because you don't have to transcribe interviews or do close readings. I mean, you do the hard work up front, design your survey, and then you're pretty much done. But we'll cover all that here. So let's start with the 2 big quantitative approaches, experimental designs, and survey work. So for experimental designs, again, just as a review, this is when you have two groups, control group and experimental groups. The experimental group gets a treatment, or something is introduced to them. There's an intervention, you might call it, and the other group does not. However, they usually feel like they do, or they're told they do, or they're given a placebo, that sort of thing, where they don't know if they were given the treatment or not sometimes. And that's the difference. We don't need to get into it too deep, but like a blind and a double blind study. A blind study is when the participants don't know which group they're in. And then a double blind is when the researchers, except for one, doesn't know which group people are in either. And so it's very, it's hard to fake. It's hard to say that there was something else happening besides the treatment when you find differences, if you find differences between the two groups. But the example here, one of them is like the vaccine trial. So you've got, let's say two groups. One gets a vaccine, the other does not, although they got a shot of something, like a saline solution or something. And then at the end, they'll do antibody tests and see who has them, who doesn't. And then they can say how effective the vaccine might be. For something more like what we would probably do, I've seen a variety of communication-based experiments. They're not as controllable necessarily as hard science, but they're still useful. So with those, you might think, okay, if I want to look at, I know a lot of you were talking about social media, and you want to expose people to certain types of messages on social media and see how they respond. So let's say you're interested to find out if people who see images of other similar people, like college students seeing other college students, sort of living their best life, right? So they're on vacation, they're somewhere exotic, they're out of the country, they're having fun. If they see those images, how will they react in terms of their own emotional state, or what they might post next, or what their response to those might be? And so if you did this one, you could divide the groups. You've got two groups. You could determine beforehand what those best life group settings might look like. So what were those pictures? And then the other group might get things like, the control group might get just normal pictures. And then you would sort of see what the differences were. I've done an experimental study with communication, a couple. One for me was how students feel about professors using slang in the classroom. And so with that one, I had two groups, control, experimental. Actually, I had 6 groups. There were 5 experimental and 1 control. And the way that one worked is that I had messages not recorded but typed, and I would describe the instructor. So I would say, okay, instructor, picture this instructor. They are male or female. They're this age. They have this rank, this degree. So like a 40-year-old woman with a PhD who is a full professor, for example. And then there would be a message that either did or did not include slang. Now, all the messages include slang except one, and you guessed it, that's the control group. And then I would have the students rate that professor in terms of dynamism, credibility, approachability. And that would be the study. So then I was able to determine that students generally like when professors use slang in the classroom, but there are limits. They like it better when males use it than females. Sorry, ladies, that's just what I found. I'm not saying it's a good thing. There are age limits, especially for women. If you're over 40, don't use slang if you're a woman. Your credibility just is destroyed. Men can get by with it longer, but it will also depend on the type of person you are. So like a traditional professor, it's kind of like a 40, 45 cutoff as well. But if you are, that professor, the one I want to be one day, that's, you got a different response. It was more popular. So again, the big idea here, 2 or more groups, at least one's a control group. Then you want to compare what you find after the intervention. So here's the steps that you would take. First, identify a population of people that you want to understand. So college students, Grand Valley college students. It could be people in your senior class, whatever, as specific as you want to get, you can. Now, if you get it down to where it is, the whole population or the whole group that you're predicting things about, excuse me, is so small that you can't really sample everyone. It wouldn't really do much good to predict about, like, our class, for example. There's 7 or 8 folks enrolled in the class. And so, I don't know if quantitative approaches would be the best, but if the group that you want to predict about is, 25 to a million people, I mean, you can use quantitative methods pretty well. So you need to identify the group first, then decide on who can and who cannot participate in your study. Are you looking at current students, past students? Can past students still count? Can you get by with saying, just because maybe you need more numbers, can you say, are you or have you been a student at Grand Valley? Yes, have been a student. Okay, now, when you answer these questions, I want you to put yourself back into the mindset of when you were a student. That might work for people who have been out for 1, 2, maybe 3 years. But, for people that have been out of school for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that probably won't work very well. So you'll want to make decisions about who can participate. Males, females, other demographics, was it age, ethnicity? And hear me on this. We, of course, want to be inclusive, but it really depends on the group that we're trying, or the population we're trying to predict, and what their makeup is. Now, at Grand Valley, for example, I think we are, don't quote me, this isn't exact, but like 60% female and 85% white. And so ideally, your group, the subset of that, the participants in the study, would be about 60% female and 80% white. And that would give you a more accurate representation. Now, if you only want to predict about women at Grand Valley, then of course you would only want to use women in the study. If you only wanted to predict about non-white folks in your study, then that's who you'd want for your sample. So determine sort of what group, what population, what large group you're predicting about, then which people are you going to bring into the study. And then once you do that, divide them into those 2 groups. And really do this as randomly as you can. You see some examples here. Divide it to equal groups. What I'd like to do is a random number generator. So if I've got 100 folks, I would just give everyone a number and then hit a random number generator and then do that 50 times. And those people would be one group, and then everybody else would be the other group. There are other ways to do it, but as long as you have fairly equal groups that are not chosen with any sort of patterning, because you do want this to be random, then you're probably in good shape. Then after you do that, prepare and conduct your pre-test for both groups. Now this should be the same. So for example, with the study I was referring to with slang, I sort of did it a different way, in the sense that before I ever wrote up the scripts of here is a slang included or a slang free lecture, I had to do some, we call it a manipulation check, where I needed to then figure out if the slang I was assuming was slang that was used was actually used slang in the current time of the study. And so I had to come up with these different slang terms, and then I would on my own write down what I thought they meant, how I would use them, not share that with anyone, and then I would give the survey, which I would put sort of columns like a Word document. Here's the slang term, here's a space for people to write in what they think it means, and here's another column for people to use it in a sentence. And through that, I was able to determine, and I think I also put the popularity, like how often do you hear this? Through that, I was able to determine the top 10 slang words that people responded to, and those are the ones that I included in the study. Now, again, this is a dissertation that took a couple years to do, so I don't think that you're going to need to go into that kind of depth, but for a more simplified study, for one that is like that social media study, you would want to, ask questions like, okay, so when you see these types of images, how do you respond? And then you could use Likert scales, right? So agree, strongly disagree. When I see these images, I feel blank, strongly agree, strongly disagree. And you can go on and on with that. And so you'll want to establish a baseline measurement. That way you can see that two things. One, those two groups should be the same, statistically speaking, the same. That doesn't mean that, if your possible points are 10, it doesn't mean that both groups have to score a perfect 5. That means that when you do a comparison statistically, and again, I can help you with all this, there shouldn't be a major difference between those two groups. Then for the post-test, that's when you'll want to do the same survey or a very similar one, but it's after the intervention or after they have seen the images. Then you want to look and see if they're still the same or are they now different. And then you can determine with some sense of certainty that the reason they're now different, assuming they are, is because of that intervention that you did. And so there would be your post-test, and then we can run the numbers in, SPSS, unless you like another program better. And we can compare and see where their differences are. The more demographic data that you provide, or that you collect, really, is better. And we're going to get to that in just a second. But you can then determine if the difference was stronger in different sexes, different ethnicities, different age groups, whatever it might be. And so it's usually a good idea to have more than fewer demographic entries. So we'll come back to that in just a second with the next one, which is survey work. But just a cap off experiment, right? You're going to pick a population that you want to know a lot about. Then you're going to determine the sample for that population, who's going to be included in the study. Then you're going to divide that sample, that smaller group that is going to participate, into two somewhat equal groups, randomly assign them to those groups. Then you're going to give out a pretest to measure baselines, and then you're going to do an intervention for the experimental group, not the control group, although you can give them something if you want to. The thing there is just to make sure that you don't give them something that's not benign, right? You don't want to give them something that is going to, again, change those scores on the back end, on the post-test. So it probably need to be careful with that, but it's not too tough. And then you'll do the intervention, as I said, and then administer the post-test. So the next one, survey work. As you'll remember, it's fast. I mean, it takes a while to design a survey, especially if you do it really well, but it's quick once that part is done. What you'll need to do is come up with, they're called items and questions. It depends on how you phrase them. A lot of people will say they're questions, but if you've got a statement like you agree or disagree with this, that's not really a question at that point, because you're responding strongly agree, strongly disagree. But you'll come up with the items that measure what you need it to measure. And again, if possible, you'll want to use an existing survey that's already been checked for validity and reliability. Now, you'll look at those two bolded terms there. Validity refers to accuracy. Does it measure what you intend for it to measure? That's really what you're looking for there. And this would be sort of like a bathroom scale. If you get on it every morning and it says that you weigh a certain amount, then it's doing what it's supposed to do, in the sense that it measures your weight. But we still don't know if it's accurate really, because does it represent your true weight? So what you would probably then do to test that accuracy is to get 10 scales, stand on all of them, and see what the difference is. And you'd calibrate them, of course, and move it to the 0 and all that good stuff. Now, reliability is it consistent? Is it repeatable? So if you think of like a target, and all the shots are on the target, but they're spread out, then you can say the shooter is accurate, but they're not reliable. They're valid, but they're not reliable. Whereas if they're all clustered together, all the shots are clustered together like at the bullseye, well, then they're very accurate and very reliable. If the shots are clustered together and they're off the bullseye where the person was aiming, let's say it was over here, then they are very reliable, but they're not very accurate because we need to move over there to be both. So, what we'll do with that, if this is something we need to get through for your work, we'll do it's called a factor analysis, and we'll see if you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. And again, it's not that bad once you get the hang of it and know how to do it. And I'm very happy to help with that. I actually kind of enjoy it, so let me know if you need my help. Again, if possible, use an existing survey. It helps when you're writing questions or items to make sure that they are correct, that they're effective. And what you should also know is that if you are using other surveys, plural, you can combine them. But again, you'll want to run your own check to make sure that those are doing what you hope that they're doing. They probably will be, since they've already individually passed. But when you put them together, sometimes something funky can happen, but generally it's going to be absolutely fine. And we'll double check that as well. So let's go through how this might look. So again, you're going to identify a population and recruit a sample, exactly what we just talked about above, for an experiment. Then you're going to design or locate a survey that allows you to answer your question. So for example, there's a survey out there called the PRCA 24. It's the most commonly given communication survey ever. A guy named James McCroskey, who's now deceased, but he came up with this. He's the most published communication studies scholar ever. I met him once. He's a very quiet man. He's one of those guys where you meet him and he's just like, how are you, Dr. McCroskey? It's an honor to meet you. All right. But rest in peace, Jimmy. So what you're going to think about there is that his scale, the PRCA 24, the Personal Report of Communication Apprehension, with 24 questions, measures how anxious you are about speaking, but it also groups the questions in a way that you can look at how comfortable or not you are with public speaking, group speaking, one-on-one speaking, private meeting speaking. And so he's got these questions that you can configure in different ways to measure specific things. And then overall, it measures your anxiety. It's really ingenious. It made him a lot of money. But with that, you can break that thing apart and use it because it's already been divided out into separate subscales. And that's really what you would be doing if you took parts of an existing survey. You'd be making a subscale. So pro tip here, it's always better, as I mentioned before, to have as much demographic data as you can get. It's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So, you'll want to make sure that you ask all the questions you can. Where it can get a little tricky is to ask these demographic questions in the right way. So for example, I've done a study before where I wanted to know I wanted to know something completely unrelated, but with demographics, I was looking to see if there was a difference between white students and minority students as a whole. Now that's problematic in the sense that when you group everyone who's not white in the same category, it doesn't feel right. I mean, it's not if you're treating people a certain way. You don't want to just say, okay, here's the white group and here's the others. It's inappropriate. But for research purposes, I just wanted to check and see if there was a difference between majority ethnicity and minority groups. And so when I made the quiz the survey, I put on there, what best describes your ethnicity: white, Caucasian, non-white, Caucasian. And boy, I got some blowback. I mean, people were writing on the survey like, how dare you? You need to list these out. And they were right. I should have. It would have made for a much better design, even though I wasn't only looking for the others. Now, let's say that you list out, 10 ethnicities on there. One is Caucasian, and the other, African American, Asian American, Native American, you name it. Hispanic, Latina, Latinx, whatever you want to put. But when it's all over, when you're running the data, if I only want to know the difference between one group and another, I can collapse all those other groups with the same coding like strategy. So when I enter the data, I would enter a 1 to code for Caucasian and then a 2 for everything else. And then I get the information I'm looking for, but the survey looks better and presents better, because if people don't answer my questions, if people read my demographic questions and they get instantly pissed off at me as a survey designer, as a researcher, they're not going to really pay attention to the rest of my questions. They're going to go in, sort of hot when they're going through these items. Now, you should always put the demographics at the end to avoid that, but still, you see where I'm coming from. So grab all that data you can, but do it in an appropriate way. Then you got your survey ready, send it out to the sample. Now, even before COVID, online surveys were the way to go, and it's still that way. So, you can use through Grand Valley Qualtrics, which is really useful in terms of working with the data after you're done with it. I'm a glutton for punishment. I like paper surveys when I could do those. I just find that it's faster, and it's harder for people to say no. So, if you do a Qualtrics survey, you shoot out an email link to the survey, but as well as I do, some people don't check the email, and other people will see it and they'll be like, hey, do a survey. And you're like, nope. And you just keep moving. But if you go to the library, let's say, and you recruit, a couple students to hand this out, because me walking around doesn't work as well either. And then those students walk over with, again, pre-COVID, a piece of paper with the survey on it and a pen for you. And you say, hey, you take the survey, you can keep this speech lab pen. Most people are going to do it. And then you're going to get all the responses you need in maybe 2 days. Whereas I do, I'm wrapping up a study right now that had 300 participants. Well, it's 321. I think I'm going to be able to use like 298. But it took 8 months to get all those people collected, where, it's faster in person, but it's easier online. Plus, the thing that you would need to do when you get those back, let's make sure I don't get too far ahead of myself. Yeah, for number 4 here, if you get a satisfactory number of responses, then you're going to analyze those. Now, if you do it on paper, the survey on paper, you've got to transcribe the numbers over. So you have to manually code into a program like SPSS. But if you use Qualtrics, for example, you can direct import into SPSS and then run your numbers from there. Again, I'm happy to help you do that. This isn't a methods class, so I won't get into the actual analysis too deep. We'll touch on it later, but let me know if you need that help. But we'll run an ANOVA usually, or a MANOVA, maybe a t-test, depending on how many independent, dependent variables you're looking at. But from there, we're going to be able to find out again what people thought. And just like the experimental design, where we have experimental and control groups, now those demographic questions, male, female, ethnicity, gender, whatever it might be, those will become individual groups themselves, and we'll be able to really get a clearer picture of if there is a difference. And if there is, we can do what's called a post hoc test, and then figure out exactly where that difference is. And so it's very useful in terms of being able to pinpoint observation and really figure out what is happening and who it's happening to. What it can't do is figure out why something is happening. So I can definitely tell you that students prefer when young professors, young meaning under 40, use slang in the classroom, especially when males use it, but there's an age cutoff. Now, I can't tell you why they feel that way. I can make my own assumptions and say, well, I believe it is because of this, but I can't know that for sure until I do something like a qualitative study to figure out and ask people why, and then they can tell me. Okay, so those are your 2 quantitative approaches. You've got the experimental design with your 2 groups, an intervention, pre and post test. Then you've got your survey work, where you design or find a survey, Send that to your sample and then crunch the numbers on the back end. Now, to move into the qualitative approaches. The first one you see there is a narrative approach. So with this one, we kind of already know what this is, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it's, you're trying to figure out what the general reaction to an experience is. So if you want to find an individual or a group who has experienced the same phenomenon and from a very similar or the same vantage point. So for example, here you see it there. We want to understand how GV students felt when they read the email from GV's president announcing tuition would increase for fall 2020, regardless of a COVID pandemic happening. Now, for this, you don't need to gather 300 people, right? You only need one really to do a narrative, but generally, 2 or 3 or 4 folks would be fine. Maybe 8 is sort of a good number, but you would want to get them all from the same or similar perspective. And that means you want all students. You don't want you don't want administrators or professors because they might see it differently. There's a time for that. That's phenomenology, which we'll come to in a second. But for narrative design, it's all people who have seen something, experienced something from the same angle, if you will. Now, even within students, though, there are some things to be aware of. You've got some students who could care less what tuition is because their parents pay for it, and it doesn't matter to them. You've got other people who could care less because maybe they're on a scholarship and price goes up, price goes down, the scholarship covers it. But then you've got people who either pay for their own tuition or take out loans, or maybe their parents help them, but only to a point. And so for those folks, we could just group them together and say they are very interested in the price and it matters to them. And then we could find people like that. And from that group, we can pull out our 1 to 8 people to interview. You could also do it based on other factors, like you see there, freshmen or freshman on-campus residents, and you could get as narrow as you want to. So what you're going to do then is set up an interview. A couple things about the interviews. There's quite a bit to understand about an interview. It's not just, hey, can I talk to you about the thing? It's more than that. So one is that you'll want to double check the accuracy and time the accuracy of the time and location of the interview. So for example, if you say to someone that you're going to interview, hey, meet me at 9:00 at the subway in Allendale, that's not great. Why not? Well, because maybe it's 9 a.m. or maybe it's 9 p.m. If I was talking to a professor and I said, meet me at 9, then I'm pretty sure they would go with 9 a.m. Now, if I said to a student, meet me at 9, that could go either way. And if I say, meet me at Subway, some people may think, okay, yeah, on campus, great, I'll see you in Kirkhoff. Other people would say, no, down the street by Hungry Howie's and the mobile station in Allendale. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong. They're both accurate. It's just that you had one understanding and I had another. That's called bypassing. So you want to double check to make sure everybody's on the same page as to when to be somewhere and where to be. Establish with them an expectation of time and content. So, people that give you an interview, be respectful of their time. Let them know if you expect the interview to take 10 minutes, half hour, an hour, a whole afternoon. I doubt it. But so they know what they're getting into. As far as content, it's a good idea to double check that as well. Let's say that, you're doing something a little touchy. Your survey or your project or the phenomenon you're studying is losing a loved one, or maybe a child losing a parent. And, you might tell them, I want to talk to you about the experience of losing your parent, but I do not want to talk about maybe things that you regret or any details of the passing. Again, maybe you do want to get into those issues, but whatever you decide, let the person know so they're not caught off guard. You can have emotional responses. They can be overwhelmed with sadness. They can be angry at you, and it doesn't have to be a touchy subject like death, but generally speaking, you'll want to let them know, here's what we're going to be talking about. The next item there is to ask permission to take notes and or record the interview. You definitely want to take notes, and most people aren't going to say no to notes. I mean, you might just have your notepad out and say, just make sure it's cool if I write some stuff down while we're talking, right? Yeah, okay, good. That shouldn't be a problem. Now, if you want to record the interview, realize that you have to let them know that. It's tempting, I think, for some folks to just turn their phone on like a voice memo and put it in their pocket and let it go. That's illegal, especially in Michigan. So, you could go to jail for that. And if you're doing that with research, I don't know if you want to go to grad school or not, you'll never go. I mean, you'll just never work in the field if you get caught with doing something like that. And you shouldn't have a problem with it. I mean, all you need to do is say, is it okay if I record us? Now, if they say no, you still need to go ahead and go with the interview, but don't record. And it's interesting. Like, I feel, from my perspective, when I am recording a lecture like this one, I am more careful with maybe what I say than I would be in a classroom. That doesn't mean in the classroom that I just go all out and, all over the place and inappropriate. But I know that here someone could chop a video and make it sound like I said something I didn't say. And a lot of people are concerned about that. If somebody, a speech guy like me, said, Adolf Hitler was a terrible person, but he was a very effective speaker in a maniacal sort of manipulative way. But if that was cut and it was like Adolf Hitler was a great person and a great speaker, what? Like Carl said, what, we have evidence of it. So you want to be careful. I know none of you would do that, but it's on some people's minds, and they're likely going to say it's okay to record them, but they're also likely not going to give you their full, honest, and open opinions because they're trying to guard against being taken out of context. But make sure that you check in with them. Then have a reliable way to take notes or record them if you're going to do it. So multiple pins, so that if one dies, you got another one. Make sure your phone's charged if that's what you're using to record, whatever it might be. And pro tip there, even if you're recording, take notes. Take notes. And if your phone, for example, if that's what you're using, where mine is here, I'll show you exactly what I mean. So if I go to voice memos and I hit record, let's see if you can, no, okay. Let me jump back here. You're going to see the actual background. Sorry, I had to do a Harvard meeting this morning. Yep. But here, if we do background, blah, 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 none. That's my basement. You can see there on my voice message that I've got that timer, or the counter rather. So if you say something very interesting to me at the 5 minute and 6 second mark, I can just see where we were when we were talking. I can write down the timestamp, and now I can come back and reference that later when I am taking sort of my final look and review of what we've discussed. Sorry, I'll get my big head out of your way again. We'll move it over here. So do take notes. Prepare a list of questions. Always prepare more than you need. Don't rely on you being able to come up with these questions in the moment or just having them sort of in a mental list. You've all said this and heard this. There was something I was going to ask you, but I can't remember right now. I'll have to get back to you. You don't want to bother people with that. Now, it's okay to call them and ask for more information or another interview sometimes, but generally you want to have the questions ready more than you need. And as they speak, you might notice that they answer questions in advance. And if that's the case, that's great. Just go ahead and make little notes about, they answered this question at 17 minutes, but you thought maybe it would come a little later. That way you've got it. And that way you're not asking them about the same things they've already answered. That just gets annoying. Plus, it's a waste of your time and theirs. So have that list ready. Thank them when the interview is over. And then whatever you do after, make sure that you schedule time. So if your interview is from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m., 9 a.m. to 10 p.m., my God, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., then don't just block that out on your schedule. Block out 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Because from 10 to 11 following the interview, you want to do what's called a data dump. And that's when you go in and just write down everything that you remember from the interview. I know you've recorded it. You've taken notes. Trust me, write it down. What do you think certain things mean? How did you see their face change when they talked about something? What was their response when you said this particular word that you saw them sort of maybe have an emotional reaction to? Get specific and give yourself time to do that. Then you can reflect on those notes and start writing up the report. This is what happened in this interview. Let them know that you may need to reach back out. And then when everything is over, send them a thank you email. And then from there, when you get all of these interviews together, you can look for themes that emerge from the interviews, common things that you heard from multiple people if you're using multiple people. And then you can, as you see down here, re-story the stories that you've heard into one big story. And that will represent the experience of something from a particular viewpoint. So how did students who live on campus and pay for their own tuition respond when the president sent out the email that said, we're raising tuition in the middle of a pandemic? You can know that because you've done the work. Now, another type of qualitative study is an ethnography. So with the ethnography, it is very similar to what we might think about sort of like an undercover reporter, if you will, an embedded reporter. So, this isn't as huge now as it used to be. I think it's because there's some legal and moral, ethical questions about it. But it used to be the case that you would have people go undercover and join groups as a reporter and then do what they would call an expose about what they learned somewhere. There was a whole movement in journalism called gonzo journalism. Hunter S. Thompson was not really undercover, but he was sort of that gap between undercover and embedded. Like he was an honorary Hell's Angel because he rode with them and learned all about them, and a variety of other things. It's the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas movie, if you're familiar with that one. Not the Hell's Angels, but the guy. So the idea here is that you want to become part of a group in order to explain how they experience something. So you become an insider. That requires you to have a gatekeeper to gain access to a communication group normally. The only exception there is if you're already part of the group that you want to know more about. Maybe you're sort of a tacit member or a fringe member that is not active. So for example, of all things, right? I'm this very liberal guy. I'm the member of a shooting range in town. I like to shoot. I'm from West Virginia. I'm that guy. But I also am strongly in favor of gun control. So while I am a member of the gun club, I don't sort of ascribe with the views of most of the members. Now, if I wanted to figure out, more about them and how they responded to, let's say, the Biden election, well, then I wouldn't go undercover. I'm still me, and they still see that I have my membership card. But, I may change the way I express my views while I'm around them in order to make them comfortable with me so that I can get honest information from them. Now, hear me on this. There's a difference between highlighting certain parts of your belief system or your personality, who you are, and making up a whole new character for yourself. That's not what I would be doing. So you want to be honest with people, but you do need to sometimes sort of, we call it accommodate toward, converge toward their style of communication in order to get more accurate and honest answers. Now, if you're not a member of a community, that's when you'll really need the gatekeeper, someone that can get you into that group. And again, in an honest way. You're not trying to, totally tell them that you're something that you're not. They need to know that you're doing research, but it doesn't need to be in their face all the time. And here's what I mean by that. You see there, the researcher can be a participant or a participant observer, but must be inside the group to get that inside knowledge. And the goal is to understand the group experiences, how they feel about or react to something. And so let's go through the steps, and then we'll see how this might work. So identify the group that you want to know more about. You must both disclose that you're conducting research to the gatekeeper and appear non-threatening to the group members. Now, this is where we were going with the last piece of the conversation. You need to be natural, but also honest. And sometimes those can feel like they're in conflict with each other. But, if you were doing research on a group and they knew that you were a researcher, but that doesn't mean you need to walk around taking notes during all the meetings and recording things and, doing sort of like the doctor thing with your phone. 3:31 p.m. Person A said that they're doing the thing. And, people noticing you do that is going to remind them that you are the other. You are the researcher. And that's not a good move because it's not going to encourage honesty. And so keep that to yourself. Now, maybe you need to take periods of time to where you go to the bathroom or you're out of sight, out of mind, and you make quick notes or you speak into your phone. That's fine, but you don't need to do it all the time in front of everyone so that they're constantly reminded, oh yeah, that's that guy. But the longer you're in a group, normally the more comfortable they will become with you. So do take those notes, but do it sort of stealthy, or that might be the wrong word. Be sort of incognito with it. There's that voice recorder. As soon as you're done interacting with that group, every time you interact with them, do the data dump. Once you've participated and observed the group, you can reflect on those notes and then start putting what you've observed again into themes and then writing up your report. Now, this one's a little tricky sometimes depending on the group, right? I mean, you can imagine if you wanted to get inside the minds of white supremacists that attacked the Capitol, there's some danger to you there, especially if you're dishonest, right? And you claim to be one of them, and then they find out you were really just doing research the whole time. If you tell them you're doing research, they may not let you in because you're a lefty academic person and you don't blah blah blah. So you got to find sort of the happy medium that gets you in the group and gets them comfortable enough with you to be honest with you, but still being honest. Okay, phenomenology. Next one here. This is like a narrative, but it's sort of a more inclusive view of something. So just with that same example, this would be like not only asking the students what they thought when the president said we were going to raise tuition, but other members of the Grand Valley community. You'd want students involved, but then faculty, staff, alumni maybe. It's up to you. Parents would be good. So what is this? It's similar to narrative. It's different though because it's using multiple viewpoints. The accounts can be so it can be about exactly the same thing, or maybe even something that's similar. It's a type of event. So, maybe we weren't the only school that raised tuition in the pandemic. So if you have friends that went to U of M or State or Ferris or wherever, and they had a similar experience, you could still include them in the study and say, not really how Grand Valley students responded, but how students, maybe in Michigan, if that's where all your friends are, responded to a raise in tuition during the pandemic, or how campus community members responded, because you're going to take it from a more broad perspective. If you want to, you could again go more narrow, right? If you only wanted to look at students, that's fine, but use a variety of types of students. Now, instead of just students who pay for their own way, those who are on scholarships, student athletes, those whose parents pay for their education, that kind of thing. You want to get it all in there because what you're trying to do is capture this holistic view of what researchers and phenomenologists call the essence of an experience. And that will include pros and cons, what's good about it, what's bad about it, people's positive responses, negative responses, and it's going to get you this fuller, more complete view on whatever it is that you're studying. So, how do you do this one? Well, you need to identify what you want to study and then find individuals who experienced that thing from ideally a variety of viewpoints. This is usually not that hard. Once you find one person who's experienced something, they probably know someone else and they know someone else and they know someone else. And we call that a snowball sample because it's like a snowball. If you keep rolling it, it keeps getting bigger and bigger because more snow sticks. And so this is the way that the sampling process would work. Now you'll interview each one and you'll probably need to talk to them multiple times because you're going to have some new questions. That doesn't mean that you need to, block out 4 30-minute interviews. Just make sure the person is okay with you emailing or calling them to get small pieces of additional information. So follow everything we talked about with interviews and narrative and make sure that you're doing the interview properly. And once you feel like you've got all the interviews done on the first go through, collect all the data, start, you guessed it, right? Looking for those themes, things that were mentioned frequently. And then you can use what's called the constant comparative method here. This is from 2 folks called Glaser and Strauss who developed this, but it is a method of analysis where you look at a theme, and let's say that only one person in your 5 did not mention that theme. They didn't bring it up. Well, okay, one part of it is going back and asking that person, did you experience this? Because it's so popular. Now, you don't want to let them know everybody experienced this, but did you experience it? Then they might feel like, I should probably say yes. But if you say, question that came up in my work, did you experience this? Point blank, then you take their response. If you saw where, there were maybe 5 things that emerged and there were some leftovers with different people, you would take those leftovers and then go back to the people who did not include the leftovers and ask them, hey, did you experience this? And what you may find is that 2 rounds is enough, right? You get all the responses you need. But if in the second round of interviews or question asking, someone brings up a completely new theme, then you'd want to reach out to everybody else again. Hey, did you experience this? And it seems like it's, a lot of ongoing work that never ends. It's not. I mean, it's simply writing emails and phrasing things in a way that doesn't invite a huge response. So you might just say things like, have you ever experienced this? Yes or no? If so, in less than 50 words, tell me about it. That's fine to do because it's going to get you what you need, but it's also going to keep the interviewee from feeling overwhelmed and you, more importantly, in this case, from feeling overwhelmed. So go back once you're finished with all those and nothing new is out there, report the themes in your notes, start working on the report, and then you've got it. You could talk about if there are things that are different based on a viewpoint or an individual, their status or their demographics, whatever. You might in the discussion section highlight that, we had these 5 themes that emerged that everybody seemed to agree with, and here's what those mean as I'm interpreting them as the researcher. But there were these 3 things that 2 people had this one, 3 people had this one, and only 1 person had this other one. Why was that different? Well, I think it was because, and then you tell them why you think so. I mean, you've studied this from a variety of viewpoints. You probably have a pretty good opinion on that. So then that's your phenomenology approach. Last but not least, and this should be, well, I see what I've done there. I've just not moved it over in the right spot. A case study would be the last type that you might use here. And this one is interesting because it can be quantitative or qualitative, though it's normally qualitative. And I'll show you what I mean with that one. So with a case study, you're going to identify a case to study. I know, right? Mind-boggling. But what is important to understand is that a case is, as you see down here on the page 37, it's a bounded system, a group, instance, or event that can be clearly separated from other groups, instances, or events in order to observe an event in its context before and after an action takes place. So with this one, you're going to try to collect artifacts and documents that relate to this. So let's say that it is that same study. The case would be the email that went out that said we're raising tuition in the middle of a pandemic. Okay. The document that you obviously need to start with is that email text, right? You need to know exactly what it said. Other things that you might collect could be if there was a letter to the editor in the paper about it, if they posted it on social media, what were some of the comments that were either in favor or strongly against it? Here's where the quantitative kind of comes in, is that if you found that, Grand Valley's official Twitter account posted, we're raising tuition, and there were, let's say, 100 comments, responses to that tweet, what percentage were positive, what were neutral, what were negative, what were very negative, maybe very positive. I don't know. You have to see. But you probably want to divide that out numerically and then get into the content a little bit more. So let's go ahead and jump down to this page and we'll talk about how this might work. So identify the case. We've done that. Gather all available documents and artifacts. That will vary depending on what your topic is. Take notes on everything that you collect. Again, you can start looking for themes in like those comments, for example. And stay with me here, because what we've just described, honestly, is a content analysis coming up next. The thing that separates those two is the idea that you'll also do interviews. So I've got it here. It's crucial that you do this thoroughly before proceeding to the next step. And this is where you take notes on everything you see the themes, because if you have people that are willing to talk about it and carry out the interview, you'll want to follow all those normal notes, but also use those themes as question creation. All right, so if I found that there was this theme about anger and a theme about concern, financial concern, then I would probably want to ask people that I interview, so tell me when you heard the news, what was your response? And whatever they say, write it down. It's important. But if they don't mention anger, you might say, well, did you feel any anger when this came out? They can tell you if they did or not. And if they did, well, how much did you feel? I mean, they don't have to quantify it, but was it, real indignant anger? It was just really, this is wrong morally, ethically? Or was it sort of a, man, I got to spend more money? What were you angry about? And then, if it was the financial concern, maybe they'll say, I was angry because I spent more money. There's both of those combined. But if they don't bring up finances, you should ask about it, because those are the themes that emerged from the documents that you have already collected. So, next, seek to clarify anything that you hear. Go back, check the documents against the responses from the interviews, and then analyze all that information. And that's going to help you create an understanding of what happened. And more importantly, I should bold this, extract lessons from the case. What can be learned from the case? Now, if you've been in comm for a while, and I guess most of you have because you're seniors, you've probably, I hope, at some point looked at the Challenger explosion, the Challenger disaster, as a case study. If not, it's fascinating. It's a really good example of what can happen when groupthink comes into play. And the nutshell is you had a couple high-ranking NASA officials who were depending on the Challenger mission being successful in order to be promoted even higher. When they were promoted even higher, the assumption was everybody that worked on that team would then also be moved up, probably by the people leading the team, right? If you've got a good team and you move up, well, you want to bring your team with you. And that means you've got more prestige, more money. And so the two folks that were leading the charge, if you will, looked at all the evidence and they said, okay, we're going to launch. There was one or two folks that said, no, we shouldn't. It's going to explode. Here's why it will explode. And they explained the gas leak system and the ignition, blah, blah, blah. But the other folks decided to not side with them because what can you give me? You can't give me a better title, office, or salary. So I'm going to side with the people who can. And that is groupthink, and we had a disaster. And so that is something we can learn from. We can take lessons from it. For the GVSU tuition example, maybe you find, if you interview the president, for example, or a financial officer of the university, that they had good intentions with raising tuition. Let's say they wanted to make sure they could maintain quality education, that they had, I don't know, a rainy day account, whatever it might be. That they had good meaning when they did it. They didn't have an option but to do it. You may find, I don't know that. So with that one, maybe then you determine the lessons to learn. If you have to raise tuition, let people know in a more subtle or sensitive way that acknowledges the likely negative response that's going to happen, right? And so you can counter a lot of things, a lot of negativity that might come from a decision like that. If you get ahead of it, if you will, if you go ahead and say things like, look, I know this isn't great. I know that many of you are not going to be happy about this, but please hear me out. And then you could explain it. That might be the lesson you take away. Okay, next up and finally is the content analysis. Now, as I mentioned before, it's a lot like a case study, but it doesn't involve people. And so this is often put in the quantitative or qualitative column because you can do it both ways. And arguably the best content analyses are mixed method. They're both. So what you'd want to do, find the event, maybe again, it's the raising tuition. Then find every document you can that relates to this. So of course the email, the responses on social media, all platforms where there might be. See if you can, in this case, FOIA request. Sorry, I've got some noise upstairs. If you can FOIA request any emails between administrators when they were making this decision, and really get at motivations, how they determined to write the message, the responses to that message. So you get this, like phenomenology, this holistic account of what's happening. Then what you'll want to do is create a code book or a coding system. And so we'll come down here and say that we've gathered everything. Look at it carefully. We call that close readings. That's close reading doesn't mean just like slow down and take better notes. It requires you to think critically about the context. So, for example, again, making this up, but if an email from one executive said to another, they're going to love this, we're going to have to raise tuition, then you could take from that, they were aware that this would likely have a negative response from the student body. They said as much, but they still didn't find the time or take the effort to make a more approachable or acceptable message. They just pushed it through. And that might be something that you take away. But when you get all that together, develop a coding system. So what you'll do there is write down themes that you see repeating themselves. Reword them so that you keep making them simpler and simpler. So if one person says they're going to love this, we're going to have to raise tuition, and another person says, yep, not going to be good, winky face, or something like that, then you might put in there sort of maybe they were being facetious or they're being sarcastic. You want to keep shrinking that down to a smaller and smaller category so that it can include more and more things. And then you put everything that you find into one of those categories, and that's your code book there. And so you're going to record the number of times these things happened, and that will be sort of your quantitative element here. And then from the numerical data, as you see, you can interpret the themes, because if one person was sarcastic, that's probably not a huge issue. But maybe you want to highlight that person A really needs to work on the way that they word their emails because they're not being student centered. You can make that argument if you wanted to. But you're going to, again, go back and look for those repeated themes only through documents and artifacts. By the way, an artifact would be different if it were, instead of a document, like a film clip, like a YouTube video, if it were sort of, this probably really, that would be the only example here. Maybe, I don't know, maybe if there was a news story about it, that would probably count. For others, you could have, more traditional artifacts. So if I wanted to study Grand Valley and their branding, then the artifacts would be like, stuff with the logo on it. You can't see that, but I have a cup with the logo on it. And that would be an artifact there. So that's what I mean when I talk about the two. Okay, so quick review here. We talked about quantitative approaches, experimental design, and survey work. Then we moved into qualitative with narrative and restoring. Remember, that's all from the same viewpoint, the same vantage point. An ethnography, getting inside of a group somehow and reporting out on what you find. A phenomenological study or phenomenology is when you, like narrative, get a perspective on an issue, but now it's from multiple perspectives. You get an understanding of an issue, but from multiple viewpoints, not just one. A case study, when you find a very bound system, right, a group, an instance, an event, and you look at both artifacts, documents, and interview people to learn what can be taken away from that, what lessons can come from it. And then finally, a content analysis, which does not include any human interaction besides maybe gathering the documents, but there's none of that that will go into the actual study itself. It all comes from what's already there with artifacts and documents. Okay, so this week, again, if you're watching early in the week, you have your lit review due at the end of this week. Don't forget that. And then from there, we're going to start talking about collecting data and how that will work. So you'll need to figure out by the end of this week the question that you're going to ask, or questions, through the lit review, right? That comes at the end, the research question. Then you'll really quickly need to determine how you want to try to answer that. Which of these approaches will give you the best shot at getting an answer, a meaningful answer, to your question? It may be that multiple of these examples can get you where you need to be, but you'll want to then pick one and be able to justify why you chose it. Not in like a, I'm going to write a defense of my approach, but in a single sentence even. This study took on the form of an ethnography. Ethnography was used because blank, period, move on. But you'll want to be able to at least mentally understand that you didn't pick one randomly, or you didn't think, oh, that one looks easy. But you'll want to make sure that you've got a reason, a justification for using it in order to answer that question. So pick that, again, pretty quick, because next week, jump back up here to our schedule. Week 8, we're going to talk about collecting data, and that's going to look very different depending on which approach you take. Again, as you can tell, it could take, the survey design route, or it could take finding people to interview route, and that'll be very different. So that's coming up next week. As always, if you have questions about literature review or a method or anything else related to the class, let me know. I'm here to help. I'll respond quickly. I hope you have a great week and hang in there. We're halfway through. See you later.